welcome everyone to the 2025 eBEEF.org Brown Bagger Series, as we're now called, formerly the NBCEC Brown Bagger Series. Here's the deal. We've been doing this now, I think it's 21 years. I think we started in 2004. So that's a pretty good haul. We appreciate everybody. There's a lot of names that I'm seeing on the attendee list that have been with us since the very beginning. And we welcome you guys back. Any new participants, we welcome you as well. Want to give a little bit of a shout out to my partners in crime, Dr. Bob Weaber and Dr. Matt Spangler. The three of us have been kind of a long time running this. It started with me and Darrh Strobing at Iowa State. And as time goes on, when you last this long, you have turnover. And so we've actually added a new person to our group, and that's Dr. Troy Rowan at University of Tennessee, and he'll be joining us host next week. So to get us started, this year's topic is going to be innovation and application of decision support tools for the beef industry. And all right, Bob, automatically won't let me advance. Looks like it gave it back. There we go. As I said, my name's Darrh Bullock, I think I said, and I'm at the University of Kentucky. And welcome. I'm your host today. We would encourage you to visit the eBEEF.org site if you have not been there. There is tons of valuable information, fact sheets, videos, all that sort of stuff, all dealing with beef cattle genetics. So I invite you to go take a look if you haven't. First up today, we have Dr. Esther Tarpoff, and Esther is the Director of Performance Programs for the American Angus Association. And Esther, I'm going to assume you're from Kansas. I know you got your bachelor's, master's, and PhD at K-State, so I'm assuming that that's probably where you started off. So I do appreciate you joining us today, and look forward to hearing from you, and happy that you're now with the Angus Association. And Esther's topic is going to be new opportunities for maternal traits selection in Angus cattle. And Esther, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate that introduction. See if I can drive yet here. Bob, can you turn that over by chance? There we go. See how we go there. All right, so today we're going to talk about, back in May, the association would have released 3 new maternal EPDs for producers to use for selection around functional longevity, teat size, and udder suspension. We then incorporated those 3 EPDs into our maternal weaned calf value index. And so we're going to take a look at a little bit of the inside of those 3 EPDs, and then as well as the updates to that index, which also subsequently impacts our $C, or that combined value index. So we're going to start off by talking about our functional longevity trait. If you were at BIF in 2024, you would have heard Dr. Andre Garcia with AGI really get down to the weeds on this particular trait at that time whenever it was in research. For time's sake today, we're not going to go quite as in-depth as what Dr. Garcia did, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have about the trait. So as we think about our functional longevity trait, there's multiple traits out there in the industry around whether it be stayability, functional longevity, whatever the terminology may be. But our functional longevity trait at the association is really focused on identifying those females that stay in the herd, but they do so while producing a calf every year. So our definition around this functional longevity trait is just that. It's looking at the number of calves that a sire's daughter is going to be producing, specifically at 6 years of age, when we compare that to other sire's daughters. And we're going to dig in a little bit deeper around the data that's contributing to this trait. But we're looking specifically at the calving and culling records and what we would also call reason codes, which would be things like they're a donor or they moved calving seasons. Things like that are also included in this trait. As we think about functional longevity and those females that stay in the herd and continue to produce a calf, pretty logical question that comes to mind is, well, why do females that leave the herd, why do they leave? You can see here out of the database at the association, really there's two main reasons that we see females that leave. Number one might be around fertility, whether she is open, whether she was late calving, could be a variety of reasons around something like fertility. But about equal reasoning that females are leaving the herd is that our seed stock producers are selling them off into the commercial section of the industry, right? So they're leaving the seed stock herd without papers to continue on to still be a productive female. They just, whether it be age, for genetic turnover, whatever the case may be that they're moving on, those seed stock producers are culling them from the herd, but they're still productive females. There's a variety of other categories, whether it be they're culled due to age or injury or management decisions, also for why females are leaving the herd. As we start to peel back a little bit of the evaluation around functional longevity, this is going to be a trait that we have data from both the American Angus Association breeders as well as our partners up in Canada. We've had data from the Canadian Angus Association in a variety of traits for well over 20 years. So we're very fortunate to have the Canadian Angus Association data a part of this evaluation as well. So this functional longevity trait is going to include just over 2 million individual females, and those 2 million individual females comprise about 9 million records. So one female can have up to 9 records in this evaluation. We're going to talk more about that, but that's how we get from the 2 million females to approximately 9 million records. Here recently in this evaluation, there's about 1.87 million genotyped animals, and we'd have about 4.5 million animals in that pedigree with EPDs predicted. One of the common questions that we get around this trait as producers are starting to think about the records that they keep and contribute to our Angus herd improvement record system are, what does the distribution of our females in the records look like, right? So how many females at that 2 years of age have records? This is going to be a chart that's out of more of our research environment compared to what we see in production today, but the numbers haven't changed a lot. So we'll get more into this, but we would have about 2 million females that would be in there with records at 2 years of age. Reason being is that a female has to have a calf at 2 years of age to kick her off in this particular trait, right? So if we look on out there at age 8, we'd have about 400,000 females still contributing, 400,000 females contributing records at that particular age. So it's what we would expect to see as females age. We see fewer records come in and follows what we expect to see whenever people are selling those females off into the commercial industry as well. So getting a little bit more specific around what records are used in this particular trait. Our whole herd reporting system, otherwise known as inventory reporting, is a system that the association has had for about 13 years. This particular data reporting system would include about 15% of the records inside of functional longevity. Our AHIR system has been in place for over 50 years, and that is going to be where the bulk of this data is coming from, and we cut it off at 1990, but that's going to be our calving and culling records that traditionally have come into the association are also being included today in this evaluation. So both whole herd reporting data and then the more traditional AHIR data that's been submitted. Like I mentioned, females have to calve at 2 years of age in order to be included in this evaluation. And we are using data from ages 2 to 10. So again, 9 possible calving events or records for a female to be included. The phenotype is going to be the number of calves, and our model is a random regression model, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. So the heritability of functional longevity at the time of release was 0.10, so a relatively low heritability trait, as we see with a lot of the fertility type traits. What I'm showing you here is going to be the heritability trajectory. This is actually coming out of our research report, so back from October of 23. But you'll notice here that we peak heritability at that 6 years of age. I mentioned this is a trait that we do predict whenever a female is 6. Part of that being is that's whenever we maximize heritability, which has shifted just a little bit from the research environment to production here in May, from 0.09 to zero point 0.1. But it does give an idea of when we do peak that heritability there at age 6. So one of the other features of that random regression model is that we have the ability to essentially have a trait predicted at each time point, as you saw with that trajectory. So then it brings up the question of, if we predict this at age 6, what does that correlate out to for ages past that? I said we use data up to 10 years of age. Well, what we found is that after age 6, those EPDs are going to be highly correlated. So whenever we predict this trait at age 6, those females that are out 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age, there's minimal re-ranking that's happening in those traits as we predict out past age 6. So very confident with predicting it 6 for what that implies out up to 10 years of age. Rehash all the points that are here, but we do see that age 6 as being a BIF recommendation for traits like this, as well as depending on the year and what prices look like. But this is that age 5, 6 timeframe is going to be an accepted industry age for whenever those females have paid themselves off and are then returning profit back to the herd whenever we predict this functional longevity trait. So we look at just a real brief example of functional longevity. If we have two sires, if we're applying this out in industry, we have sire A and sire B with a functional longevity of 1.5 and sire B being 0.05. I really like easy math, and so that's a difference of 1. And so as we interpret that at EPD, that would mean that sires A's daughters, on average, are expected to produce 1 more calf at age 6 compared to sire B's daughters. So in most cases, for most breeders, they're going to be looking to increase the number of calves produced. And so selecting towards a higher functional longevity EPD is going to be more desirable in comparison to that of a lower functional longevity EPD. So just some practical things that we've heard around this trait, right, and that we know around a trait like functional longevity. Like I just mentioned, selecting a larger, more positive EPD is probably going to be the direction that a lot of members will be looking to use this trait. But like any new trait, the spread's going to be limited in this EPD. We see about a difference of 1 calf right now. In this trait, maybe a little bit more, but it is limited at this point. But as we continue to develop this trait and have more data come in, like any trait, it will continue to become more robust. We do see some low to moderate correlations with other EPDs present. We are continuing to work through the true genetic correlations with other traits. We just don't have that just today. And like other fertility traits, the heritability around this one is low. So you guys all well know, right? Slower rate of genetic change and that management environment play a really large role in a trait like functional longevity. So we're going to talk more about functional longevity and some of the cost and revenues associated with it as we get to updating our $M trait. But that's kind of a high level prediction of that functional longevity trait. Probably the biggest take-home point about functional longevity is, right, this is a trait, while it's in our maternal suite and we think about it in terms of the cow, this is a trait where the genetic improvement is not about the 15-year-old cow that's out in the herd still producing a calf. The genetic merit and the genetic improvement from this trait is going to be coming from those groups of daughters that sires leave behind, right? We all know that, but it's definitely a point that we talk about a lot with producers whenever we talk about functional longevity, because it is really easy to think about this trait in terms of the one female that's still in production, but sometimes stepping back and looking at the bigger picture helps make functional longevity make a little bit more sense. So we're going to change gears here and talk a little bit about teat size and udder suspension that were also released in May. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the practicality of teat size and udder suspension, conformation, what that means for producers on farm, simply because I think you guys probably all know that. We're going to spend time in some other places. But we do know that the quality of the udder absolutely leads to profitability, whether that's a calf can get on to suckle colostrum, the right quantity, high quality colostrum. We know that the conformation of that udder definitely has an impact and can be a reason that females are culled from the herd, specifically for poor udder quality. At the association, we do have a scoring guide that we provide to members that want to score, has information on it, has the sketches, and then we also have a how-to scoring video that really walks members through if you're going to go out and score for the first time or you need a refresher, how you can use the guide, what you see, how to kind of combine the two into a real-life scoring scenario to help build comfort for them to go out and score those udders. So we do follow the BIF recommendations for scoring. We use the 1 to 9 scale, score within 24 hours of calving, and both traits are scored on the weakest quarter of the udder, right? So the other big thing around this, and we'll talk more about it, is scoring without consideration for age. Just score the udder for what it is, whether she's a 2-year-old female or whether she's 10, and make sure to keep that scoring consistent with the same person doing each group. So as we take a look at our teat and udder evaluation, similar to how we did for functional longevity, this is also a trait that we have data from our American breeders as well as our Canadian Angus Association partners. This particular evaluation has over 125,000 females in it that combined for teat size and udder suspension scores would have more than 433,000 scores. So again, we have our genotyped animals in there, and there would be 2.8 million animals predicted with each of these traits. The questions that we come across as we start talking about this trait is, well, what does the distribution of scores look like in the Angus population? So I've got both teat size and udder suspension up here, and it shows that there's not a lot of difference in terms of the distribution of where we see those scores. Within the Angus population, we have relatively few scores 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. So that lower half of the scale that would be a larger teat or a more pendulous udder. We don't have a lot of those in the Angus population. The majority are going to be in our 5, 6, and 7 scores, so more that intermediate type udder. The average female would score about a 6.5 for either teat size or udder suspension. So again, not a large problem on the bottom half of the scale for a trait like this. But it is something that if there are issues, having the ability to have these tools to, if you will, kind of stay within the boundaries can definitely be helpful as members are making selection decisions earlier, trying to improve the genetic trend on those animals or the genetic interval. One of the other questions that we tend to get is around, well, how many females have been scored more than once? So this is a trait that females can be scored at every calving event. And so as we look at how many records per female, we can see there's about 70,000 females in this particular evaluation that would have been scored one time. Whether she's 2 years of age or whether she's 5, 6, 7 years of age, she has been scored one time. We'd have about 28,000 females that have been scored twice. Looking out to the other end, I just think this is really cool. There is a female that has had 14 calving events and she has been scored at all 14 of those. And so all 14 of those scores are included in this particular evaluation. So I just think that's pretty neat for that particular trait. So I mentioned scoring without consideration for age. Udder suspension, teat size, right, it's a structural trait. We expect that just because she's getting older, there's more use with that udder, it's going to break down. Not due to fault of her own or genetics, it is just a structural trait. And so as we look at how those udders break down with age, we can see teat size and udder suspension in this particular image. We do see them decrease as females get older, but again, there's not a dramatic drop off as you know we would expect not to see a dramatic drop off as she ages substantially. So without reading the definitions around teat and udder EPDs, for each one of these traits, they're going to be expressed in the scoring size, and with a higher EPD is going to move progeny closer to smaller teat sizes and tighter udder suspension. So a higher EPD is moving more towards a score of 9 on that scale, right? So as we look at our EPDs and accuracy distributions around each of these traits, there's not a lot of differences between teat size and udder suspension. Our average EPD is around a 0.52, and there's approximately a 2-score spread in the data. So this, again, would have been EPD, went through our research environments, had members continue to submit data, and once we released into production, we have about a two-score spread between the minimum and maximum EPDs for each of these traits. As we dig into our heritabilities and correlations, as you would expect, our teat size and udder suspension traits are moderately correlated at a 0.32, or moderately heritable at a 0.32 and a 0.28 for teat size and udder suspension respectively. Correlation between these two traits is going to be a 0.77, so move in the same direction, but not necessarily the same trait, which is why, right, we score both that teat size and then that udder suspension as separate traits. Some of the other common questions that we get around our udder conformation traits is, well, what about correlations with other traits? We know that extremes, whether that udder be too pendulous, too large a teats, or other end of too small, or being too tight of suspension, can have undesirable results. We also know that there's some negative correlations that do exist, particularly in this example, if we take a look at our weaning weight direct and maternal traits with each teat size and udder suspension. We know that as we continue to select and move our udder traits closer to that score of 9, we can have some negative effects in terms of weaning weight, both direct and maternal, right? So we can see a decrease in that weaning weight as well as that milk trait. So it's what you would expect to see, but we do see those negative correlations between those traits for both teat size and udder suspension. Mentioned each of those 3 traits are going to be in our maternal suite of EPDs. And we did incorporate all 3 of those into our $M, or that maternal weaned calf value. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about our updated index, as we tend to get a few more questions around this index from members since we've had the update. So our maternal weaned calf value index, this is going to be an index that's really describing the profitability differences from conception to weaning. This particular index is built on the breeding objective that females are being retained as replacement females within the herd, right? So producing our own replacement females, and then any of the cull females and all the male progeny are being sold as feeder calves. So this particular trait, or this particular index, has 12 traits included. We have both calving age direct and maternal, our weaning weight and milk values, newly added teat, udder, and functional longevity, our mature weight, docility, heifer pregnancy, and then our foot conformation traits of claw shape and foot angle. So as we start to talk about $M, we need to go back and think about how we got to the point of having the maternal weaned calf value index to start with. And it started with some feedback from the industry. We would have done a survey several years ago around priorities of what the ideal commercial Angus female may look like. And at that time, it was ranked at the top around cow survival. So whether that be survival, longevity, that's going to be a trait that ideal commercial Angus female, it's going to be really important for her to have. All right, we all know that profitability starts with whether or not she has the ability to have those calves, and if she can remain in the herd and continue to do that year after year. We also heard some feedback around our combined value, or that $C, was heavily weighted towards terminal, and so trying to add in a few more maternal traits into our $M, thus also into our $C. So we're going to jump around a little bit here, looking at several things inside of this $M index. We're going to go back to our teat size and udder suspension. So you guys all know, as we add more traits into an index, right, there's going to be costs, there's going to be revenues associated with each trait that's added. And so just some things around our teat size and udder suspension traits that we found as we added them into, did the research around adding them into $M, is that if a female was able to stay in the herd kind of between that 4 and 5 years of age, chances are she's probably not going to be culled due to udder suspension or teat size, right around that udder conformation. So the probability that a cow is culled is greatest at 4 years of age for teat size or udder conformation. Now, as we start to look at just overall scores and the chances of a cow being culled, as we look at our 1, 2, and 3 categories, so those very pendulous, the very large teat size, there's a 75% chance that cows will be culled if they fall into that 1, 2, or 3 category, and a 15% chance if they're more intermediate in that score of 4 or 5. And chances are they're not going to be culled due to teat and udder suspension if they are scoring somewhere between a 6 and a 7 or an 8 and a 9, right? So as we get lower on that scale, closer to a score of 1, chances are they're going to be culled due to udder conformation. So as we also think about our functional longevity trait and the cost and revenues associated with building it into our maternal wean calf index, there's a lot of tentacles of functional longevity to consider for, females staying in the herd, females that are being culled from the herd. So as we think about what several of those cost and revenue sources are associated with functional longevity, one of the first one that comes to mind, specifically if we think about from the commercial section of the industry, maybe not the first thing that comes to mind for seed stock producers, but it would be those cull cow sales, right? Females that leave the herd because they're open or whatever the case may be. Generating revenue from the carcass of that female can be a pretty big profitability driver for those females that are leaving the herd, obviously depending on market. And so as we think about how functional longevity plays into that, those younger females are likely going to have smaller carcasses compared to older females. So accounting for that piece of it with functional longevity starts to add a little bit of complexity around that. We think about our calf sales. We know that the calf value is going to be positively correlated with her calf weight, right? A heavier calf, chances are will bring more dollars in than a lighter calf. However, as we think about that with functional longevity, as we continue to improve functional longevity, those older cows are going to be producing heavier calves for sale. Is typically what we see, those females in the peak production do tend to wean off heavier calves. As we also think about the average genetic merit of the herd, as we improve functional longevity, right, we anticipate keeping those females longer in the herd. But on the flip side of that, there's also going to be a lower genetic merit component to having older females in the herd, right? So just trade-off of pros and cons of functional longevity and how do you account for it inside of an index. We think about the replacement heifer cost. If functional longevity is improving, there's fewer needs for replacing females, replacement heifer cost in the herd, and needing to either purchase them or rear and retain them. Typically in these situations, you're just culling more for a maintenance cost rather than for growth or having a higher culling rate of those older females for issues that they would be having. As we think about things around feed cost, our older females are going to be in their maintenance stage compared to those younger females that are going to be in the growth stage. So accounting for improved functional longevity in herds and that could reduce the feed cost because you're not feeding females that are also continuing to grow themselves. And then things around like calving assistance. We all know that calving ease, it tends to be better for older cows. If we look at data at the association, in our 2-year-old females, we see about a 5.5% assistance rate on those 2-year-olds compared to less than 1% on our 3-year-olds. So again, as we improve and have higher functional longevity, there's decreased calving assistance, labor costs around that, calf loss due to calving problems, etc. So again, there's a lot of cost and revenues to consider with our functional longevity trait inside of our $M. All that to be said, as we incorporated these 3 new EPDs into our $M value, correlations were high. We saw greater than 0.9 correlations among our different population of animals at the American Angus Association. So again, high correlations even with adding in 3 new traits. To put that in a little bit of a visual form, I include $B on here simply because it is also a component of $C. But as we look again at those correlations specifically in our maiden supplemental sire population, our correlations were high. We're tightly bound to that to that center line there. And so again, not a lot of changes in terms of re-ranking of animals. Now, one of the questions that comes up around using indexes is, if we select on this index, part of what's so cool about indexes, as you all well know, is that you have the ability to make changes in multiple traits at once. But what does that look like? If a herd just selects, say, on $M for 10 years, what's the response to selection? And this is a graph that we share and talk about a lot, simply because it gives a pretty full picture around what we see happening with selection with that particular index. So I mentioned that $M would have 12 traits inside of it. You can see there's more than 12 traits here, right? We have the 12 that are directly included, but we also will see changes in things, like carcass weight and marbling, ribeye and fat, and other traits that are on here as well. One of the things that I want to highlight on this particular response to selection graph, if you notice there at functional longevity, this is going to be a trait that was added just in May, but we can see our previous $M in the red bars compared to our updated $M with the new traits. We still had positive selection for functional longevity, even whenever we didn't have it as a specific trait to select on, which is part of why we see a high correlation between the previous $M and the updated $M, is that there was already positive selection happening for functional longevity without there being a particular trait to do so on. It's just a really interesting graph. I won't, for time's sake, spend a lot of time going through each individual trait that's on here, but you can see what we would expect to happen when members would be selecting on $M. So again, just as a reminder, we had our 3 new EPDs in the maternal suite of EPDs that were added in May, incorporated into our $M value, and subsequently would have also impacted our $C as $M and $B are directly included into that $C value. So for the sake of time, we won't get into too many more details around those other than that, but I'm happy to either take questions now, or if we want to wait till the end, I'm fine with that as well.
Okay, I don't see one in the queue waiting for us. If anybody wants to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A portion. I think that's the best way to handle it as opposed to the chat. So if you don't mind, go ahead and put that in there. As we're making the transition, I have a question for you, Esther. So with a trait like the udder scores and teat scores, with optimum being somewhere in the middle, I always get confused by that. So how's the best way to handle that when you're looking at more of an optimum than trying to shoot for one end or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a discussion that we also have around this trait, right? Because getting too far in either direction is not going to be ideal. It's a trait where if an animal's ranked average for this trait, that's probably not a bad thing, right? It's not a trait that you necessarily need to be chasing the top 1% of the top 1% for the best, genetic progress in the herd. It's probably a trait where, you shoot somewhere in the middle there, and that's going to be a very acceptable and functional udder.
Good deal. Okay, if anybody has any questions, once popped in here, let's see what we got. Let's take this one and then we'll move to Bob. So how do you decide to use RR rather than a simpler model, maybe a repeatability model?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and honestly, I would need to defer that question to our research team at AGI. They would be the ones who would have reviewed the details around those models. I know that they looked at a lot of different models and ultimately decided that the random regression model was what best fit our data at the association, and that would be why they went that direction. And I say why we went that direction, but they investigated that very thoroughly. So happy to get more details on that, but that's something I'd need to double check with our research team at AGI.
All right. With that, if you have any other questions, please pop them in there for Esther, and I think she's going to stick around to the end, and we'll have some time, hopefully, at the end for a few questions and answers in. with that, we're going to move to our next speaker, Dr. Bob Weber. And Bob, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with our introductions. Do you have the advancer, Bob? There we go. But as I've known Bob now for more years than both of us would probably care
It's
to
been a while.
discuss right now, but I know got his early education at CSU, correct, Colorado
Yep.
State, and then worked for Simmental for a while, then went to Cornell and got his PhD, and was at Missouri for a time period, and now at K-State, and moving up the ranks there. Are you president yet, Bob? Or
I'm not president.
okay. Well, I'm going
I
to
don't
turn
want
it
to be
over to
president. Yeah.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
Bob's going to talk about the iGENDEC-based selection indexes at North American Limousin Foundation and American Gelbvieh Association. And I appreciate you being on, Bob, and sharing this updated information for us as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Darrh, and appreciate the opportunity to continue to work with you and Matt and now Troy on um, the brown bagger and yeah, like you say, 21 years. It's hard to believe we've been at it that long, but we have a good following, and so appreciate everybody out in the internet lands there joining us for the series. I do want to maybe apologize just a little bit. This talk is probably would have been better in the third session than the first session, but I'm doing some international travel here over the next couple of weeks to South Africa, and we wanted to make sure this kind of fit in the new trait development category with Esther. So I'm glad to share the platform with her today. But I do want to give you an overview of some of the index work that I've been engaged in and working on for the North American Limousin Foundation and the American Gelbvieh Association, and share that with you. I have been using a piece of software called iGENDEC, and Dr. Spangler and Dr. Bullock are on slate next week to give a deeper dive into that. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the nuts and bolts of iGENDEC, other than to give you kind of just a 30,000 foot view of what it does. Want to spend more time on the output components of what we've built. So as many of you know, I do some consulting work, and so this work has been through that arrangement with NALF and Gelbvieh, and I think some of the first deployed indexes for iGENDEC platform stuff out in industry, and so we want to spend a little time kind of updating everybody what those new indexes look like, and certainly these two breeds have had additional indexes in place for quite some time, and actually one of the motivators to doing the new work is those both are sets of indexes are a little long in the tooth, and so many of us recognize the substantial changes in economics of our business, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, and kind of makes us think about, is the index doing a good job? And so updating all the economics is a important thing to think about here. Overview here, we're going to talk real quickly about kind of index basics, and then dive into sort of the development through iGENDEC of these indexes. We'll talk about the scenarios and economic model assumptions, and then give some examples of the approved indexes that will be released or have been released at Gelbvieh and Limousin. So one of the first questions, and I get this occasionally from producers, is, well, why do we need a selection index? And I like to go back to this quote from Rick Borden. Rick was, for many of you would recognize his name, he was a faculty member at Colorado State, actually the instructor of my undergraduate animal breeding course. And he has a quote in a seminal paper from 1998 that says, "There's no easily accessible or objective way for breeders, particularly breeders in the beef and sheep industries, where ownership is diverse and production environments vary a great deal, to use these predictions intelligently." And these predictions are EPDs. And actually, if you go back in time in the evolution of our genetic evaluation architectures and methodologies. The original vision actually was selection index, and then the view became, well, we've got to build out all these traits that go into the index from a genetic prediction strategy. And so we did that. And then for quite a while, we didn't do anything else. We did new trait development, EPDs, da 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 da. And finally, here in the 2000s, have evolved in the beef space to development of these selection indexes for application of the predictions. And the important bit here is it provides context of, what are the economic trade-offs between the various traits to some particular output or endpoint. And that's really what we need to make informed, intelligent decisions in the space. And, it's a simple tool to use because it's a single value, the indexes, that is. And it's preferred because we have lots of complexity in multiple trait selection. So Esther, I really appreciate your response to selection slide there at the end of the presentation. Illustrates the complexity of, there's lots of traits that contribute to profit in our business. How do we make structural and predictable change in those and in the right ones, right? Because not all the EPDs are relevant to particular endpoints. And so making sure we have our selection pressure put on the right traits is really important. And certainly selection index does that. And it's also, I think, helps us understand and communicate value up and down the value chain. So if we're going to be at the seed stock level and want to make rational decisions relative to genetic improvement for in-product traits, say, for a terminal selection index, we need to have a good understanding of the business and the economics that drive it through the feeding and packing phase, and beef quality, pricing, those sort of things, to really do a good job of figuring out where do we need to put pressure and what are the trade-offs when we do that. So what is a selection index? Well, it's simply a convenient way to summarize information from multiple traits in an economic construct. So it's one number to use in selection. So it simplifies the selection exercise significantly for our commercial customers when viewed from the seed stock space. It appropriately weights each trait for its influence on profit, right? So we take a marginal economic value and multiply it by the EPD and add those together. That's the equation at the bottom, right? So the math here is pretty straightforward. It's multiplication and addition. The complexity comes in figuring out what the marginal economic values are. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Some alternate definitions, though, of selection index are as originally proposed by Hazel in the 1940s. So he's kind of the recognized father of this idea, if you will, when he was a graduate student at Iowa State. And it was the idea of selection for aggregate merit. And of course, this work predates genetic prediction, but was a motivator towards building more sophisticated genetic evaluation models that we would view as EPDs or EBVs in today's world. And it's a method then that we use to put a value on each trait. So another definition is what is our increase in satisfaction with a 1 unit change in a trait, all others held constant, right? So it's what is the marginal contribution to profit. So if you're the stats or calculus person, that's a partial derivative, right? So it's the change in that particular variable, all other things held constant. Mike McNeil, I like this definition a lot. Dr. McNeil's done a lot of work in the selection index space over time. Its selection index is a formal statement of the trade-offs among traits used to evaluate selection candidates. So we know of our suite of traits, some of those are associated with costs, some with revenue. What are the trade-offs as we make genetic change in those? Selection index is a nice architecture to communicate that. Okay, so in this exercise, the calculation of the index is the easy part. That's this equation here at the bottom. The hard part is figuring out what are the marginal economic values or the economic weights that we apply to the EPDs to compute the index. And there's been a variety of methods proposed to do this. So, it's sort of a purist strategy. You can think about, well, we could write out a profit function for a particular operation. If we had lots of production-based data, we could potentially do that and figure out, what are those partial derivatives. So a really formal mathematical approach to the index construction. I think a more intuitive and ultimately as complicated as these bioeconomic models are, I think a more tractable approach and a more effective approach is actually bioeconomic simulation. So building out computer simulation models that model means and variances, so stochastic modeling, to get at the heart of the biological variation associated with these traits and its impact on predicted profit. And to that end, a product was built a number of years ago. It was led this work by Matt Spangler at the University of Nebraska and funded through USDA, and had a number of collaborators. The scientists, many of you would know, Larry Keane and Warren Snelling, and Mark Thalman at the Meat Animal Research Center. They were involved. This particular funding was a strategy where they took, they called it partial solutions. So we had pieces of research out in industry that we needed to aggregate together to build out this product. And the strategy was to leverage those resources. I worked on the project some, as well as Bruce Golden, former faculty member at Colorado State and Cal Poly. Did the coding on the project. It is now hosted by the Beef Improvement Federation, so it is a living, breathing software platform and available to a variety of industry participants under different licensing requirements. I won't go into that too much, but if you want more information about iGENDEC, if you just go to beefimprovement.org, you can find a link there under our resource center for iGENDEC, and it'll take you, and there's some educational material there about iGENDEC. Matt and Darrh will spend the next hour next week program for Brown Bagger, focused in on some applications of iGENDEC at various user groups. Okay, so iGENDEC was the platform we used. It is a bioeconomic simulation, and one of the key features of this one is it is nearly fully customizable. So there are some hardwired components in iGENDEC around some genetic variation or variance component structures. It does use Meat Animal Research Center crossbreed breed differences and heritability estimates, as well as heterosis effects. So you can customize a realistic breeding scenario using multiple breeds and capture that additive and heterosis information in the process. So it makes it very useful for building these generalized indexes. Certainly individual producers are using it to build customized indexes for their own specific production scenarios using their own economic and performance data. But it also works very well for these generalized index approaches. So two breeds have been actively engaged in this part, as well as I could include Charlet here. They've recently updated their terminal sire index last spring using iGENDEC as well. The system asks you a series of questions about your breeding system to kind of start off the parameterization. And so in the case of Gelbvieh and Limousin, they both chose to use their continental-based bulls and hybrids of those mated to Angus cows, recognizing Angus cow is kind of the de facto standard cow out in the business today. And the idea is then to build tools for commercial cattlemen around a specific production scenario to make a very informed, economically informed and effective, efficient selection decision. These new indexes are not desired gains indexes, so they're not, from the seed stock perspective, we want to make our breed look, XYZ in terms of trait performance using the index. It is not that. It is designed for commercial producers to make an optimal economic-based decision for those breed inputs relative to a specific endpoint. That doesn't mean they're unuseful to seed stock producers, right? So as faculty coordinator at K-State, we used selection indexes in the breeds we had a lot, both as marketing tools to help guide our customers to the right bulls, but also as a mechanism to understand where we needed to make genetic improvement in aggregate to move the value of our seed stock populations ahead. So that's kind of an ancillary uses from the seed stock side, but the real focus is, again, commercial producers. Okay. One of the great things about iGENDEC is it is, and sometimes a little daunting, it is very customizable. And so the heavy lift is really assembling the economic data and performance data to parameterize the model. And it's got some defaults programmed in, but I want to take you through just real quickly some of the components that we customized in the model for these output indexes. So pricing data, we use a 10-year time horizon to capture full cattle cycle. One of the things that we've looked at is, if you pick a shorter time period, depending on where you're at in the cattle cycle, you can find instances where you're trying to make selection decision into a very different market endpoint or market pricing structure. And so the 10-year one kind of takes some of that risk out, right? It kind of levels out those price and input costs cyclicities to make a hopefully a lower risk decision. So we used 2015 to 2025. It's got a mid-year split, so we're not changing parameters on stuff right before bull sale season. One of the things we thought was really important is that we try and eliminate as much of the black box as possible. So we use publicly accessible sources of data, so mostly USDA or Meat Animal Research Center data to parameterize the system. Certainly, cattle performance data comes out of MARC for the breed means and breed effects, but also the sire effects to look at what the expected performance of those calves is at. One sort of challenging spot in the data, so if anybody wants to go out and find feedlot performance data that's reported on a long time series, that is reasonably difficult to do. The source we use is actually the K-State Focus on Feedlots, so this is a very long time series of feedlot data out of Southwest Kansas. And it matches up our 10-year time series for pricing data. Okay. So some of the parameters, annual cow cost goes in here. We use some USDA ERS data, backgrounding cost, days on feed during the backgrounding period, feedlot. So, for depending on the selection index and the scenario, different components of this information is utilized in those indexes. We look at animal performance data. This would be for a kind of a terminal index. We would use hot carcass weight, ribeye fat thickness, marbling score. The animal performance components, it also would model the phenotypic performance of those animals around these means. So birth weight, weaning weight, and yearling weight. Full suite of cattle prices. We use the 10-year rolling average out of Oklahoma City. So 100-pound weight breaks, separate pricing for steers and heifers. And you can see illustrated here, this was from a presentation I gave recently to show the change in the index parameters on a yearly update. So just moving ahead 1 year in the 10-year averaging, steers and heifers went up about $5 or $6 a hundredweight, just adding the 2024, 2025 data, that next time period, into the data set. So it is fairly sensitive to the pricing inputs, of course. $220 carcass value, so in the beef value here. Grid pricing for beef carcasses, so this is USDA. Reported data, this Gelbvieh actually uses the cattle contract library average price, so it is not a 10-year time series, but represents sort of the shift in demand that we've seen with higher pricing for program and prime cattle. Some bigger discounts for standards and particularly yield grade 4s and 5s. get a view of there's lots of things you can customize and change, and certainly it does require that you've got a pretty good understanding of beef cattle production economics and performance data to make that work. But certainly tractable. The two once you get all that stuff done, you set it to run. You do have to specify what your production scenario is. So the two big questions really are, what is your marketing endpoint? So it allows selling weaned calves, cattle on a live basis, or grid marketing. Fed cattle, and then with or without replacements. So you can think about, an index that requires some maternal components. If we're keeping replacement heifers, we have to consider that gene flow into our cow herd, and the economic consequence of that, right? So both the maternal performance of those females over time, but also the discrepancy in market output. So how many calves we get to the sale barn gets influenced then by how many heifers we retain in the herd, cow longevity, all those things then play a role in the model for those indexes. Of course, you can specify, breed composition of cows and bulls and the calf product that they produce, and that all goes in together to help the parameterize this bioeconomic model. Then the two outputs really are, after you hit run, you get two pieces of information plugged back to you. One of those is what we call relative emphasis. So it tells us of all the traits in the index, which ones account for differing amounts of variation in the index. So it gives us an idea of what are the big drivers and what are the less important traits in the index relative to their contribution to profit. The important thing here is to recognize that the relative emphasis is not the economic weights, right? It's just, think about it, if you're stats minded, this is the R squareds or partial R squareds. So just an accounting of variance, variation, say in carcass weight, how much does that account for in variation in a terminal index, for example? Okay. The other piece that comes out are the marginal economic values or marginal economic weights. And so the interpretation of these then are, what is the change in net revenue or profit from a 1 unit increase in the selection criteria, or the EPD that we're applying this MEV to, all of the things held constant. Okay, so it's how much additional satisfaction or how much additional profit do I get for a 1 unit change in a particular trait, all of the things constant. That sounds simple and it's easy to say, but behind the scenes, then that means we're accounting for differences in the heritability of the traits and the genetic variances of those underlying traits and the breeding objective, the genetic correlation between those traits, then ultimately their economic contributions individually to profit. And the beauty of this in the selection index construct then is that it does capture differences in efficiency. So input-output relationships, if we've got EPDs that capture information about or proxies for input costs, say mature weight or feed intake, dry matter intake EPD, to capture cost structures. And then, things like carcass weight and marbling score, for instance, or weaning weight, if we're in a weaned calf model, as revenue drivers. Okay, so it captures that information. One of the really important bits here is that the functional relationships between inputs and outputs is largely driven externally in the model by the pricing system in our economy, right? So again, it's important then that you have alignment of the input costs and the revenues from the same periods of time to capture those relationships, right? It wouldn't make a lot of sense to do we're going to use pricing data from 20 years ago and current input costs, for example, just an extreme example, of course, but you want alignment of those, because if you want to capture what those relative trade-offs are between, for instance, if I add 1 pound of cow mature weight, what is the expected cost of that? And I can tie that back to annual cow costs. Okay, so you want those two to line up. So for real quickly here, we'll go through some of these and look at the outputs. So this is a maternal profit index that's now published by the American Gelbvieh Association. It is, again, replacements retained, Gelbvieh bulls on Angus cows. And what you see here is that, there's, I don't know, 8 traits, I guess, that are included in the model. So direct and maternal weaning weight. So maternal weaning weight's milk EPD. Feed intake is dry matter intake. MW is mature weight. Stability, heifer preg, calving ease direct, and calving ease maternal. Not surprising if we're in a kind of traditional production scenario. The big drivers in a weaned calf production system are how much it costs to run the cow and what's the value of the calf product. Well, those two things are summarized really by 3 EPDs. Cow mature weight, milk EPD, because milk EPD, remember, is reported in pounds of calf weaning weight, and weaning weight direct, or the genetic contribution to growth for those individual calves. Stayability plays a role, right? Because cow longevity decreases if we have cows that last longer, that we have less replacement costs modeled into the system, and more revenue, right? Because those cull heifers go into the marketing chain versus the replacement pen. Calving ease, of course, plays a role on calf survival and cow losses and so forth. So this one's a pretty easy and straightforward. But what it means here is in the MEVs that if we add a pound of weaning weight EPD, that's expected to contribute basically $1.18 of additional profit to the index, okay, or to the production system. Stayability, if we add a 1% retention of those cows, we'll use a conventional definition to age 6, adds about $1.27. Okay. Here's their feeder profit index. So this is their terminal calf index. So using Gelbvieh bulls on Angus-based cows and selling all the calves into a terminal system, grid-based marketing out the back into the feed yard. Of course, a different set of traits, right? So we've included the carcass traits here to describe the pricing and valuation of that beef carcass. Not surprising, the big drivers here are carcass weight and marbling score as the indicators of revenue. Of course, ribeye and fat play a role, but to a lesser degree than marbling and carcass weight. Dry matter intake then is a proxy for cost. Feed cost is the big component through the feeding phase and backgrounding phase that we have to account for. And so the interpretation here is then that a 1 pound increase in hot carcass weight is worth $1.72. Okay. Remember back the carcass pricing thing said though carcasses over 200 pounds were worth $2.20 a pound, or $2.20 a hundredweight. That doesn't account for the differences in cost, right? So this selection index then is balancing out the costs and returns for changes in carcass weight. Okay, so this is net revenue, not gross revenue. Okay. Here's what Gelbvieh calls total profit index. It'd be similar in ideology to, say, Simmental's all-purpose index. So it's sell calves on the rail, but keep replacement heifers. So this is a very challenging selection objective because you fight all the antagonisms between the market signals at the carcass end versus optimization of the cow factory in the production environment. And so it shifts things around a little bit. Of course, carcass weight and marbling are still big drivers because they determine revenue principally into the system, or most of the revenue into the system. Cull cows account for some here as well. But certainly those two are the biggest pieces. And then we add things like stayability and calving ease direct and maternal and milk EPD. Some of those traits that are back end on the calf side get substantially less emphasis because the cost of production favors putting weight gain on at the feed yard versus weight gain say at weaning time due to lactation from cows. So sometimes it takes a little bit to kind of dissect these and make sense of what the economic MEVs really mean from a implementation standpoint. But at the end of the day, these tend to do a really good job of describing both the production system, the production objective or the breeding objective, and ultimately differences in profit. I won't put this slide in mostly to remind me to talk about the importance of selection of the appropriate index, right? So we know that if we sell calves at weaning time, weaning weight's one of the main economically relevant traits, and that we should use the index then that aligns our production objective and marketing endpoints appropriately. So using a selection index that's misaligned decreases our selection efficiency and guides us down potentially the wrong path. And certainly here, as an illustration, the maternal profit index is the weaned calf with replacement heifers. It only has a 0.25 correlation with the feeder profit or the terminal index, right? And so most of us would not go, hey, we're going to use the feeder profit index to select replacement heifers or bulls to make replacement heifers, right? Because it doesn't have any of those maternal traits in it. So making sure we pick the right one is really important. Of course, if you look through this table, you find that the feeder profit index and total profit, or the combined sell on the grid and keep replacement heifers, has a bit higher correlation. And that's principally driven by it's got the same endpoint in terms of carcasses. And so it's got a little bit higher correlation than, say, MPI and FPI, or MPI and TPI. Okay. One of the things we do is a little bit of litmus testing, kind of make sure. So this is a correlation of EPDs and index values for active sires in the Gelbvieh population, to kind of see how bulls sort out and what those relationships are. Make sure they're pointed the right way. We won't belabor that stuff. I want to talk real quickly. Limousin Foundation's in the process of approving a couple of new indexes. The TPI one's been available for about a year, and so just recently updated, but they are working on a maternal calf, or weaned calf index, and an all-purpose type index as well, that I anticipate will probably be out by the first of the year coming forward. So we won't kind of rehash all that, other than some of the differences that we see. The structure and the scenario development's very, very similar. It's a Limousin and Limflex bulls on Angus cows. We changed the economic data is the economic data, so it all stays the same. What we principally have to change then are the expected changes in phenotypic performance of those sire progeny groups. So we adjust, carcass weight and growth and marbling score to reflect those breed differences. And again, we use the Meat Animal Research Center to parameterize this. So it's not, we didn't make up numbers to make the cattle look great. We used actual what Clay Center says they do. Okay. The Limousin one uses actually the 10-year time series for grid pricing. So you'll see here, if you go through like a prime and program, a little less value or less extreme values here on the top end. The spread's actually about the same if you go look at the carcass library versus this premium discount schedule. But the Gelbvieh one does put a little more emphasis on marbling at the end of the day. Okay. So this will look very similar to the feeder profit index from Gelbvieh in terms of structure. It's the same set of traits, so carcass traits, growth, feed intake, and calving ease. And the proportions are about the same. So marbling in this LIMI index isn't quite as important as it is in Gelbvieh because of that change in pricing structure. But still, the big drivers really are marbling score, feed intake, and certainly carcass weight. Ribeye area picks up a little more importance here in LIMI. There's a little more variation in that trait in the population, and contributes to red meat yield differences. So, and again, interpretation here, hot carcass weight's worth $1.80 a pound. All other things held constant. Okay. Fat, some of you may question, well, why is it at minus 189? So it's a 1 inch change in fat decreases the index $189. If you go look at the EPDs, the range in fat thickness EPDs about 0.1. Across the population, minus 0.05 to plus 0.05 catches everybody. So the scaling here matters, right? So don't be thrown off that we're applying some crazy number to fat. It's on a 1 unit increase in fat, which is measured in inches. Okay, marbling score worth a full marbling score is worth about $57. Feed intake, so a 1 pound increase in dry matter intake, average daily dry matter intake costs about $22. So if you think about the feeding phase, backgrounding and feedlot period, that 1 pound change of say additional feed intake would cost $22. Okay. Correlations here very similar to what we saw in Gelbvieh between the indexes. It's important, obviously, then to pick the right one. These are the prototypes for the maternal and all-purpose index at Limousin. Of course, we do the same thing. We go through and look at the litmus test to see what those correlations and relationships are between the traits. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that it does put emphasis on things connected to efficiency. And so if you follow developments at IGS, they've recently released a sub-index called dollar gain, which is the marginal value of post-weaning gain. And so it's the value of gain less the cost to get there. So it really is a difference in efficiency, but measured in change in value. And we capture that, right? So we're selecting for animals that have more favorable input-output relationships using the index, which I think is a very positive thing. And at the end of the day, what we want to do, right? So we want to figure out the animals that have the most optimal combinations of input-output relationships and select for those in our system and use economics as the driver to get at that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop and be glad to answer questions. I know we've gone over time here just a little bit between Esther and I, but really appreciate y'all's attention and look forward to hopefully a couple of questions.
All right, Bob, thank you very much. We actually have a couple on there, and in the interest of time, we'll jump right on them. So John Evans asked, will iGENDEC continue to evolve with new features? Are you looking to secure additional funding to advance the platform and support it?
John, that's a great question. Yes. In fact, Matt will talk next week about the evolution of iGENDEC. One of the big drivers was, or big recent changes, was the addition of a beef on dairy module, right? So to use recognizing the important contribution of beef sires into the value chain through mating to dairy cows. That's certainly a very different production environment and marketing scenario than a native beef system. And so the bulls that excel in that are different. So that's, I don't want to take too much of Matt's wind or story, but that certainly has happened. Continually gets updated with new information from the Meat Animal Research Center in terms of breed effects and so forth. So yeah, it is a living, breathing thing. We've talked about some additional development work in terms of maybe some output diagnostics and that sort of thing. Blood, sweat, tears, money solve all ills, right?
All right, Bob. So Jack Southworth asked, I'm surprised, or made a comment, I'm surprised that mature weight was such a big driver in the AGA maternal profitability index. Looks like they're just selecting for bigger cows. I know what the answer is going to be, but I want to compliment Jack for at least bringing up mature weight. That's my big pet peeve these days. So go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, so it's a big influencer, but it's got a big negative sign attached to. So every pound of cow mature weight costs, if I remember right in the slide, it's about 35 cents in index value. And so it actually, it accounts for a lot of the variation in the weaned calf one, but it's accounting for differences in cow cost, right? So it's not a positive influence necessarily. The one thing you'll notice though is, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's actually driving it down. And so it's the opposite effect is what Jack was suggesting.
Well, It's got a negative economic weight, but it actually is moving cow weight up, but it's expecting, if you look at the correlations among active sires, the bulls that are ranking well on the maternal index tend to be just slightly positive or moving upwards in mature weight, but they've got a lot more growth and calf output to overcome that. So it's finding the ones that maybe the cows are a little bit bigger, but I get a lot better calf that's a lot more valuable. And the profit difference says we can sustain that.
Yeah. So from a relative standpoint,
yes.
Yep.
And
all right.
Yeah, if you go in and change cow costs substantially, like do $300 versus $600 versus $900, it changes that pretty substantially, the MEV for mature weight.
Yep. All right. Sean McGrath asked, can you comment on how the index covers traits that have a linear impact on profit until they don't? And for instance, milk has a positive impact until it impacts fertility.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure Matt can talk to this next week as well. Behind the scenes in iGENDEC is this big genetic and phenotypic variance covariance matrix. And so in the simulation, you find animals that fall out because of reproductive failure, da 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 da. And so that gets handled, even though they're expressed as linear traits as the EPDs, and so we weight them that way. Behind the scenes, it's finding those tip over points and penalizing them. So good question, Sean.
Yep. So any other questions for either of our speakers? Type them in real quick while I make this little plug. I'm going to tell both of you, I really appreciate the fact that both Gelbvieh and Angus, for somebody that works in the Southeast, and our big driver for profitability here is going to be that selling those feeder calves. And so we appreciate those maternal indexes that have that focus. So you other breeds out there, please come on board. Everybody needs those indexes as well. So thank you, guys.
You bet.
So one last plug, any last questions, type them in, but next week, session 2, Dr. Spangler and myself are going to be talking about different aspects of iGENDEC. He's going to be telling you more about the development and the index itself, or the software, and I'm going to talk about some of the usages that I've been able to get out of it, and maybe share some ideas. Would love some input from anybody else that's used this in educational purposes as well. And as I said, Dr. Troy Rowland is going to host next week and officially join the team, Bob. Not seeing any additional questions. And it's past time, so people can get off. But Esther, I do have one last question I'd like to ask you. I'm curious if you even collected the data to know, but I'm curious about the failure when it was happening in the females, because I'm assuming that it's fairly heavily skewed, or I would normally think, the ones that are going to fall out are from having that first calf to getting them pregnant to have that second calf. But when I looked at that chart you had, it looked like that maybe the biggest fall off was from a 3 to a 4-year-old. What am I missing, or do y'all have that information?
Yeah, that's a good question. So thinking through that just a little bit, and I have not looked at that data in a little while, just to be honest with you, to be refreshed on that. Got to remember, part of what we're also being included in this is that as females just leave a herd, right? If I have a herd and I sell, females out to the commercial industry or sell them to another registered breeder, they fall out of that evaluation as well. So that could be a time point, that bigger time point of maybe it's not necessarily a fertility issue, but we lose them in that evaluation because they exchange hands.
Excellent point. Yep. I would be curious to see the data on the fertility rate and just how big a hit that is from that getting them pregnant the second time.
Yep. And those are some questions that we're digging into as well.
All right. I don't see any new questions coming up, so I'm gonna shut us down. We appreciate our speakers. Thanks, Bob and Esther. Great great discussion today and great topics, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care.